Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
It is not an exaggeration to say that a state of crisis exists in British democracy and in the relationship between the country and its mass media, particularly the state broadcaster, the BBC, which everyone in Britain is obliged to pay for on pain of imprisonment.
But it is the relationship to Her Majesty's official opposition which is, if anything, becoming more acute by the day. The government and the media are treating the opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn as if he were a criminal rather than, as the Constitution requires, the alternative Prime Minister.
A huge swathe of his own MPs think and act as if Corbyn was a criminal too. One man charting it all is one of the brightest stars in the new media firmament from one of the best alternative media platforms, the Canary. He's Steve Topple, and he joins us now on the Sputnik. Steve, thanks for coming on the show. This last week in British politics, has it been an omni-shambles or a cluster you-know-what?
I think neither of the above are suffice to cover what an omni-shamble cluster you-know-what it is, George. It's been quite staggering, hasn't it? Just to see the whole Skripal poisoning case develop, and the way the government has manipulated the situation, and we've seen the likes of Boris Johnson caught out for lying.
Yes,
and
we saw his lips moving.
Well, that's always a warning sign, isn't it, when something comes out of his mouth, which is generally should be in a sewer. However, it's been quite staggering, especially with the retraction of the tweet from the Foreign Office. They deleted this very sort of telling tweet, and then everyone jumped on it. It's been staggering. I don't think, when history looks back at this period, and especially this decade overall, I don't think it's going to view us kindly, because it's unbelievable the way the government is behaving.
I feel that's right. Discombobulated wouldn't cover it either, but when the Porton Down fellow, which presumably the government put up for interview, said what he said, it really shot the government's fox, don't you think?
Absolutely, yes. I don't think they were expecting it. But what kind of shocked me more was the way the mainstream media, a lot of them jumped on it and said, oh, everybody's using this to say that Russia's not guilty, Russia's not guilty. They're effectively using a straw man argument. I had it myself with several journalists on Twitter. But no one's saying that Porton Down was saying that Russia didn't do it and it vindicated Russia. What it proved was that the government had completely overreached their position.
I think the Easter weekend will be studied by people decades from now as the point of crescendo in the destabilisation of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, which reached, you may say, its apex, its zenith, or maybe its nadir, when Jeremy Corbyn was accused of anti-Semitism for attending a Passover dinner held by Jews in his own constituency because they were the wrong kind of Jews.
Absolutely. Let me just pick my jaw up off the floor with all this, because I mean it was the most preposterous situation, and everyone's saying this, you know, bad Jews, good Jews, blah blah blah. These Judas, the organisation, who are quite they're sort of borderline anti-fascists and quite anarchist, really. However, they are Jewish people, and this whole smear campaign against them was anti-Semitic in itself, labelling some Jews good, some Jews bad, and yet no one realised that.
Especially when non-Jews are doing the labelling.
Well, it's none of their business. Sorry, I nearly swore there. But how dare they do that? I mean, that is anti-Semitic in itself. And I think this has been a long time coming, though. I've discussed this with you before, and we've seen this building from the whole Czech spy smear to the situation with the General Secretary elections in the Labour Party and the John Landsman situation, to then Debbie Abrahams being booted off the shadow front bench temporarily.
But if we have a government that is enduring week after week of omni-shambles, and a Labour Party in which, from what I can see, Corbyn scarcely has a couple of dozen Labour MPs on his side, this can't hold, can it? It's bound to fall apart somehow.
I'm not sure. I mean, myself and my partner, we've been discussing this at length. And if you look back at the past 8 years of Conservative rule, we've had 114 files being lost about allegations of child rape and sexual abuse in the CSA inquiry, the Child Sexual Abuse Inquiry. We had alleged Tory election fraud, where the Electoral Commission really let them off the hook, said, well, they did sort of do some things wrong, but they didn't know they were doing it, so it's fine. We had that. We have Boris Johnson's constant gaffes. We have reports from renowned experts saying 120,000 people have died due to austerity. We have human inquiries into disabled people's human rights being gravely and systematically violated, not my words, theirs. And now we have this. It's just staggering what is going to bring the Conservative Party down, because so far nothing seems to be, it's all water off a duck's back to them. They keep bouncing back, they keep ignoring international bodies like the UN who are criticising them. They can lose files on child sexual abuse, they can commit electoral fraud without knowing it, apparently. What is it going to take to finish the Tories?
I'm not sure that they're bouncing back. Maybe a dead parrot
might be too generous,
bounce.
Yeah.
But my point is, and you're a man of the left, you are writing from the left. We don't have an we may have an opposition leader worthy of the task, but we don't have an opposition party worthy of the task, at least in Parliament.
No.
I mean, if for example, the Queen said, I no longer have confidence in Mrs. May, is there anyone else in Parliament who can form an administration? It wouldn't be Labour, because most of the Labour MPs are against their own leader. So how's that going to work out?
I agree, and I have no solutions to this. I mean, I know the term was used many decades ago in reference to the EU, but we have a democratic deficit currently in this country. As you quite rightly point out, the Labour Party, through no fault of Corbyn's, in my opinion, that is in a state of omni-shambles, as well as the Conservative government is. And all of this is detrimental to the people. And with local elections coming up, who knows where we go from here?
Well, what about the media now? I mean, one of the reasons why you are becoming very famous and the Canary is going to a greater and greater number of people is that there's a parallel crisis of the British media, which again I think may have reached a tipping point this week when the BBC, pardon me, ignored the Porton Down development that we started talking about. That may have been the point at which the people finally lost trust and patience with the British state broadcaster.
Absolutely. The reaction on social media, and it's from people on social media who are usually quite defensive about the BBC, have been coming out and really criticising it. And I think you're correct to say it is a tipping point. Many of us have known the BBC's faults and weaknesses with regards to its news output for quite some time. But the fact that the situation with Boris Johnson and Porton Down, everything that's gone on there, has been so out in the open, and the fact that Sky have been the ones exposing a lot of it and covering it.
Trailblazing this week.
Which is I never thought I'd hear that come out of your mouth, let alone my thoughts. But it's true, they have been. And for the BBC's position is looking untenable. And I think you're right. There's been such a realisation with so many people that the BBC is no longer fit for purpose. And my argument with it is, and it's always been the same, if the BBC was a private funded institution where you chose to pay to have their service, fine, let them do what they want. However, this is public money, which, as you pointed out at the start of the show, we have to pay. And we shouldn't be paying for this nonsense and rubbish that is espoused by their journalists and them as a broadcaster day in, day out.
Newsnight this week had a debate on Russia with 3 guests, all of whom had the same point of view. Very enlightening discussion. Nobody's watching Newsnight anymore, except those who are watching it to be horrified by what the monstrosity it has become. The same is true, isn't it, of the newspapers. Now, you're right to make the distinction. These newspapers are privately owned. The owners can do with them as they please. But the public are voting with their feet and abandoning newspapers at a rate of knots, which is good news for the Canary that you work for.
It is good news for us. However, it kind of puts me in a quandary because we shouldn't be in this position where you have to have people like me who I never trained as a journalist. I never had any intention of being a journalist. I started...
Thank God you never trained as a journalist. You'd be just like the rest of them.
Yeah.
But I never intended to be one. I started blogging when I was on employment and support allowance and had nothing else to do, had no money to do anything else. I couldn't go to demonstrations to show my protestations about what was going on in the country. I had to blog because it's all I could afford to do, sitting in my mum's spare room. I never want to be in this position. I don't want this situation where the media is so terrible and so full of sewerage all the time that people have to turn to the likes of the Canary. But it is what's happening. It's because people are becoming wise to the fact that there's so many vested interests at play that nothing can be trusted. I mean, when we fall as a country in Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index to 40th this year, there's former Soviet bloc countries which our government are quick to sort of point the finger at and frown upon. Their media is rated freer than ours is.
Well, the Russian media is far more plural than the British media. I think nobody in Britain knows this. But in fact, the number of newspapers, magazines, television stations, radio stations that hate Putin is greater in Russia than it is in Britain. But we still sail along imagining that the world admires our media and the BBC and so on. It's a level of self-delusion that is quite chilling, actually.
It is quite chilling, but I think you know as well as I do, sort of 40-odd years of neoliberal, corrupt, crony, corporatist, capitalist, whatever you wish to call it, economics and...
That's quite good. That's quite a good definition.
I could go further. 40 years of this push for society to be governed and people to have individualism as their driving force, and this push of capitalism and individualism and caring about self, and it's kind of nurtured a society where too many people now go, oh, it's not my problem, I'm not worried about it, and there's not a criticism of...
in a comfort zone, they've got to...
It is, yeah, and that is neoliberal economics and neocon right-wing agendas doing, to make people individualised. It's a phrase, the best phrase to sum up for me is one I've used several times in an article, is that as a society we've become so obsessed with self that we've forgotten about each other. And you witness that in the way that the mainstream press can just continue unquestioned and have been continuing unquestioned, because people do read and shrug their shoulders and go, it's not my problem, and back to watching EastEnders or whatever.
Steve Topple, you're a star. Thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Coming up next, the Russians did it, or did they?
Welcome back to Sputnik. The fiasco of the British government's handling of the Salisbury spy poisoning affair is now familiar enough, and not now just with the viewers of RT.
After momentarily being caught like rabbits in the headlights, the government and its media, particularly the Times, the vanguard of anti-Russian news, are back on the front foot.
It was the Russians that did it, they still claim. And the Times claims to know exactly which test tubes were used. Of course they do. Joining us to delve deeper into this Witches of Salem affair is independent researcher, a man with a long track record of smelling and finding rats in official stories. He's David Morrison. Welcome back to the Sputnik after a long absence, David. The normal rule of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. But the British government today are not stopping to dig. They're digging themselves deeper. How do you see that?
Well, obviously they were discombobulated by the man from Portendown, who seemed to be worried that the findings from his colleagues there were going to be used for purposes that were not appropriate, that they were going to add to the government's case that Russia was responsible, when in fact there's really very little that comes out of that has come out of Portendown that backs up the government case.
Is it because, as I like to think, experts, scientists, even intelligence operatives have read the Chilcot inquiry report? They don't want to be left holding the parcel if this whole thing blows up, and therefore they're defending their professional territory, if you like, and not being prepared to allow politicians to misuse their expertise.
I think that's certainly possible, what is going on at the moment. You may recall that Craig Murray was of the opinion that the various people were under pressure to say that this stuff came from Russia and it had been identified as such, the stuff that was actually used. And they resented the fact that they were being put under pressure to do this when, of course, the scientists had no evidence to prove that at all.
The government are really walking a tightrope here, aren't they? Because by doubling down, they've increased the stakes. The news now is that the daughter, Yulia Skripal, is discharging herself from hospital. If she comes out and tells a different story to Theresa May and Boris Johnson, the government could fall off the high wire, couldn't they?
That's obviously possible. Though I wish I was as confident as you that you know, Europe has disappointed me intensely. The way in which they backed up this non-story.
A European government expelling a single Russian diplomat, or two and a half in one case, is not much of an act of solidarity, and itself signalled a lack of confidence in the British government's position. And German officials in particular, although Angela Merkel has now slapped down the official in question, German officials in particular seem to be the least persuaded of all.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, up to now, the sanctions have been diplomatic, largely. I mean, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to see that Europe's going to do any more, and Britain can't really do any more on its own since it's still in Europe. So, in economic terms, so on the face of it, not all that much punishment has been meted out yet.
Well, not if it really was a military nerve agent attack by a foreign power on the streets of a European Union country.
And presented as an attack on the British state, essentially.
Yeah.
Just very quickly back to Yulia, because I was fearing for Yulia and her father from the beginning, wondering who was protecting them in the hospital and what would happen if they indeed would wake up. And they have, by the grace of God, they are. And Yulia is going to be dispatched from the hospital. What's going to happen with her next?
Well,
is she going back to Russia, you think? Will she be safe there?
Yes, I mean, am I right in thinking that the Russian embassy still hasn't had contact with her?
That's what I thought.
They haven't,
That's
no.
what I thought.
There's only the Russian cousin in touch with her, and she said that Yulia said she's about to discharge herself, and moreover, that her father is fine.
Happy days, if that's true.
Yeah, whatever else it wasn't a successful military-grade nerve agent attack.
No. Yes, I mean, see, obviously, the way in which the British authorities kept the embassy out of this, particularly when she is definitely a Russian citizen. Definitely. Seems to be some doubt as to whether he is also a Russian citizen still, and kept the Russian embassy away from all this stuff, the business about the court case and so on and so forth. You would have thought that they should be involved as normal if this happens with somebody else. Sure to goodness the embassy would be involved to help along and see that they get things done right and so on and so forth.
17 countries in the OPCW in The Hague abstained from voting, and the Russian position was lost in asking for a joint investigation into this affair. That in itself, not necessarily, but to me, speaks volumes. Why wouldn't you want a joint investigation?
Yeah, it's, well, I'm not quite sure what was being proposed exactly there, you see, because obviously what's going to happen now is the OPCW is going to, having farmed the samples taken out to various labs, which is what they do in the normal course of events, when the results come back, I presume they will be announced publicly. And it's going to be obviously very interesting to see whether or not what they find conforms to what is has been said by Porton
Well,
Down.
I'm assuming that Porton Down rushed out their statement, which, as you say, the government were discombobulated by because they knew that the OPCW were going to say something similar.
Yes. Now, what happens in the OPCW after that? I don't quite know. Theoretically, you know, there's this mechanism within the Chemical Weapons Charter whereby an individual state, if they have a concern about what's going on in another individual state, can request what is known as a challenge inspection. Yeah. So clearly Britain should be asking for a challenge inspection in this laboratory where...
Well, the Times have identified, yes.
Apparently so, where somebody has whispered in their ear. Yeah.
Well, you know, the conduct of... Leaving aside who did it, none of us know who did it, but leaving that aside, the conduct of the British government's narrative has been sadly in want of consistency and accuracy, and that's why there is such widespread public scepticism rising to derision about the government's voice. Is this partly because the British government itself is so weak that the Prime Minister's political position is so flimsy?
Yes, but unfortunately there's been near unanimity across the political spectrum on the issue.
You don't think Jeremy Corbyn struck a cautionary enough note?
No. I mean, I think he could have done better. I mean, he did actually try to give him his due on the Wednesday when May announced the punishment. On that day, he actually did try to ask a question about the very issue, which
heaven forfend.
He asked
question in
he
Parliament.
Asked a question: had the appropriate tests been done and ported down to try and establish whether the origin of the agent, and it's sometimes possible to do that because there would be, as it were, impurities in the stuff which would be known to have been in stuff made in a particular laboratory. He asked a reasonable question on that. On those lines, but that was just brushed aside, and he was.
Now, look, David, I've worked with you for nearly 20 years. I know the quality of your research work, and I know researchers don't go for speculation. But if I forced you to speculate, what would be your speculation? What lies behind all this?
I just haven't a clue. I mean, it's. I mean, the one thing that strikes you is that it must be an enemy of Putin. Because, I mean, he couldn't possibly have organised this. I mean, even if he was in the business of killing spies who were dormant for 10 years or something like that, why didn't he leave it out till after the World Cup? You know, why did he use something that would be immediately associated with Russia, which would allowed the British government to do what they've done? We all know that they haven't produced proof, but they have produced I mean, clearly the person that did this wanted this to happen, wanted the British government to behave in this way, wanted the punishment, such as it is, to be applied to Russia, to Russia be further demonised. Putin didn't do that.
Well, it's odd because they most of the time paint him as a Mephistophelian genius who's capable of rigging everybody else's elections. But at the same time, he's such an idiot that he does such a cack-handed thing as this, and one which, moreover, doesn't even succeed in killing the target.
Exactly. It's just...
David Morrison, I'll always be following your research on this and on other matters. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
How is Jeremy Corbyn going to succeed, you know, with all this bombardment of hostility towards him? Tony Yuan says, if democracy means anything, he'll be the next Prime Minister. If the media are as powerful as they think they are, then it means very little.
Well, both of these propositions are true, aren't they? And the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We'll have to wait and see.
Have to wait and see. Now, who is lying, the scientist or Bojo? Rob says, what difference does it make? Kremlin is still as guilty as hell of state assassination in the UK. You picked the one time Johnson didn't actually lie. If you listen carefully to the interview, you just infer it.
Well, that's a point of view, except nobody died, nobody was assassinated, and the jury's out on who did it. As to who's lying, most people would take the word of the scientist rather than a here today, gone tomorrow politician, especially Boris Johnson.
Well, that's all the tweets that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.